Hey, thanks for checking out Nuts and Bolts with Tone, and welcome to my channel. Today we're going to talk about my top tools for diagnosing engine problems from mechanical engine problem, gas and diesel. So right off the bat, your ears are your number one tool. You want to have your ears always open, because anytime you start a vehicle, anytime it's cranking over, you want to be able to hear if there is a problem with the engine. So I had a Honda a few months ago, came in for a check engine light. As I was starting it, I could hear that there was a compression problem. It just didn't crank over smooth. Turned out it had a dead cylinder. So those are the things that you want to be listening for, because if you have a dead cylinder, if you have a low cylinder, you can chase the coil and the injector and the spark plug to your blue interface. But if you have a mechanical problem, then you're just going to chase your tail. You're going to waste your time. Throw a compression gauge on there. Number one thing, compression gauge. So the compression gauge that I use is this snap-on set right here. All right, I've had this one for a long time. I use it a lot. So it's a regular compression gauge. It's a snap-on. I know it's right. I know it's correct, and I know it's not gonna fail on me. Not a real fan of cheap diagnostic tools. You got to be able to trust your tools. So this one here is just, it comes with a gauge, and it comes with a long reach plug and then a short reach plug. Now I use this one almost every single time. I hardly ever use the little short one. And I also use this with my leak down tester, because my leak down tester, it doesn't have a long nipple. And so all I do is, if you're gonna do that, very important, this bit me a long time ago, before I really thought about it. If you're gonna use any compression adapters, make sure you take out the Schrader valve. You don't want a Schrader valve in when you're using a leak down tester. The Schrader valve is there for compression. It holds the compression. So in that case, you would just take the Schrader valve out. You can use this with your leak down tester, provided it works, provided it adapts. So that's my compression gauge. This thing goes up to 250. Always look up your compression. But I mean, if you're looking at mechanical, the most important thing is that, well, obviously the compression reading, the minimum and maximum reading, but you also want to make sure you look up what the manufacturer is recommending. But really, I mean, if they say compression is, 160 and all your cylinders are 150 and they're even, it's probably not a problem. But just make sure that you look, and also check all the cylinders, compare. If you have one bad cylinder, check one on the other side of the motor just to see what a good cylinder looks like on that engine. And don't check the cylinder right next to it, because if there's an issue between the two cylinders, it'll cross over. So I like to do compression two ways. You look at three things when you do compression. Your first pump. The first pump of compression, what I was taught was it should be half of what your compression reading is going to be. So if it hits 75, you're going to go to 150. Now this is general rule of thumb, and it's not always correct, but for the most part, that first pump is pretty important. If it only hits 25, you got a big problem, and you know right away. Always look at your very first reading, because sometimes your first reading can be different than your second and third. I've had vehicles that had a problem. Once I did the compression, it increased as I went on. If you have a low cylinder, put a couple of squirts of oil in there and recheck it. If your compression comes up, you got a ring problem. That way you know that's the lower end, it needs a motor. So, and I also have two other adapters that I bought that work for my snap-on, and they are for the different spark plugs. I believe this one is for the Ford with the long reach plug, and then this one here is for the little tiny spark plugs. And so you're gonna need these to test compression on most modern vehicles. The next tool, now this one's really important, and a lot of guys don't have this tool, is cylinder leak down tester. Okay, so let's say you do have low compression. Well, what's wrong with it? Well, how do you figure it out? Well, you got a leak down tester, and you bring it to top dead center of the compression stroke. Use your compression gauge. Have somebody bump the ignition. As soon as your finger, you're on compression. Now just find top dead center. Then you're going to hook up your your leak down tester. You're going to hook on your leak down tester, and you're going to have this zeroed. All this is going to be all the way open. You're going to hook it up, and before you hook it up to the car, you're just going to hook this up to the air hose, okay? And then you're going to turn this until this gauge here reads 0. And then you're going to plug it into the car, and then it's going to tell you how much leakage you have. This one here, it looks like at 70% is where it goes to bad. And this shows you a gauge of where good and bad is. So what you're going to do with this is going to tell you if you have a leak. I mean, it's going to tell you how much leakage you have. It's also going to tell you where the leak is, not this gauge. You're going to take off the air intake boot. You're going to take off the radiator cap, and you're going to go to the exhaust pipe and the oil cap. And you're going to listen for air. If you're doing it and you hear shh out of the exhaust, it's coming out of the exhaust valve. If you hear it out of the oil cap, you got bad rings. If you're hearing it out of the intake, out of the throttle, you got bad intake. The bad intake valves, intake sealing, something like that. And then if you see bubbles in the radiator, you got a blown head gasket. So that's how you use that. And that's really important that you have that tool. Now the next tool is, it's kind of the same tool, but two different tools. So you want to get yourself a vacuum gauge. Well, a vacuum pump / gauge. So this one here, it has pressure and vacuum. So I can turn this knob and I can turn it to vacuum and I can turn it to pressure. Now pressure is important if you're checking, let's say you're checking for, you know, some sort of pressure that's being applied with the vehicle. You can see this, it'll show it. And then the vacuum, obviously you're going to look at the vacuum so you can see your vacuum reading. Now you notice this gauge is pretty small. So a lot of times if you have a misfire at idle, but it doesn't misfire off idle, it only misfires with the throttle closed or if it's real rough, but as soon as you give it any throttle at all, it runs better. You can see it with this gauge, but it's really hard because it's really little. That needle is tiny. But what you're going to be looking for is you're going to be looking for that vacuum needle to be, it's going to be fluttering. Well, it's going to be fluttering because you have an upper end problem. So if you have that problem and you have a fluttering vacuum needle, a lot of times you have a valve train issue. You have a warped valve. You have a valve that's not seating properly. You have an excessive carbon on the valves causing them to hang open. You have a valve seat problem. You have something in your valve train that's not sealing. Now another way you can check that is you take your Schrader valve out of your compression gauge and you put it on a cylinder and you start it up and you look at running compression. Generally, I was taught that running compression is half of compression. So if your compression reading is 150, your running compression is going to be 75. Is that always correct? No, it's not. They just say that's a rule of thumb. I like to compare a good and a bad, or two goods and one bad, and that way I know. If you have 100%, if you have perfect compression and you have zero leakage, then do a running compression or look at your vacuum gauge, look at manifold vacuum for the needle to be bouncing. If the needle's bouncing, then do a running compression. Running compression will show if you have a valve that's hanging up, if you have a warped valve, if you have a burnt valve, if you have any sort of a valve issue causing a sealing issue, that will show up. Actually, a burnt valve will show up on a compression gauge. But any sort of sealing issue in the valve train, you'll see that slightly off cam timing. Now, you also want to get you a big vacuum gauge like this because the size of this needle, you can see this one moving a lot more than you can that itty bitty tiny needle. It's really hard to see that other one. It has to be pretty bad before you can see it with that one, but this one you can see it really well. So you want to get yourself, now when you get a vacuum pump, make sure you get a good one. So this is a Mighty Vac. Now I know Mighty Vac also has a plastic one. Don't buy the plastic one. This has got a metal body. I've had it for like 10 years or so, and a few years ago I had to rebuild it, and I bought a rebuild kit and it didn't cost hardly anything. I took it all apart, put it back together. It's a brand new vacuum gauge. Now my last tool is for diesels. Now I bought this because I pretty much mostly work on Power Strokes. but this actually works for, you'd be surprised how many vehicles use the same glow plug pitch. So here is my Snap-on diesel compression tester. Now I know that they make a lot of universal ones that have all these different fittings that you can screw onto the end. That's a real pain in the butt when you're trying to get somewhere really hard and the fitting gets stuck and you can't get it off and you're having to get a wrench down there to get it off. It can be really difficult. So I bought this because I want to make it easy. I want to make sure it's right. And this gauge goes up to 800. So a lot of diesels are 500 pounds of compression. If you have this thing in the windshield wiper and you crank the key over, you could break the window. This thing has a lot of compression on the first pump. So this one works just like my other one. This is just diesel. So I bought 2 adapters. I bought this one here, and this is for 6 liters. And then I bought this one for 7.3s. Now the 6 liter, I can't remember which one, but one of these works for a Sprinter as well. So multiple diesels use the same glow plug thread pitch, and they work for a lot of different diesels. I've checked for Sprinters. I've checked, I don't remember if I did a Duramax. I think I might have even done a Duramax. I can't recall what their thread pitch is. I think I've done a Duramax, Power Stroke, and Sprinter with just these 2 adapters here. You know, obviously you're gonna, if you have a diesel, obviously you're gonna bump over the starter and listen for it to crank over smooth. But if you, then you really need to check compression, because you can't just call it an engine. You check compression, and then compression doesn't lie. So these are my top diagnostic tools for engine mechanical problems. I strongly recommend that you get a decent quality one. You don't necessarily have to get Snap-on. That's my personal preference. I know that they're good. I know they're not going to fail, and I like them. You know, they work good, and I don't have any little tiny things to screw together and all that. So I don't have to deal with that stuff. I like it. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope I helped you out with some diagnostic tools and maybe even explain some stuff with a leak down and check for valve train problems. Hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit the bell. You get notified of all my future content. And also check me out on Instagram at Nuts and Bolts with Tone for my daily life as a mechanic. And I appreciate you watching the video. Let me know in the comments below if you have any questions about any tools that I've showed, or any tools that you think that I should add to my arsenal. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.